Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brundiger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Lee Sidebottom. As you can see behind his left shoulder there, he's got a wall talking about NeuroTracker. That's something that he's involved in, and I look forward to us having a conversation about that. So welcome, Lee, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and maybe tell us what NeuroTracker is all about.
Okay, sure. Pleasure to be here. If you want to start with NeuroTracker, something I'm kind of quite proud of actually to be involved in, and it kind of happened spontaneously. So I was somebody who was sort of living in lots of different countries. I was teaching in different capacities, moving around. But when I actually went to university, I did a master's degree, which was primarily sort of business management based. But as part of the master's degree, it was required to do a 3-month internship. So I actually got in contact with somebody new who ran a sports gym, and I did an internship there to manage it for a few months. But actually, the guy who owned the gym turned out to be an extremely fascinating character called Mick Clegg. 2 of his sons played for Manchester United football team. 2 other sons who were sort of international champion weightlifters, and a daughter as well who also followed in their footsteps. So he had something really special about him, but he'd never been an athlete himself. He'd been a musician, he worked as an electrician, and he just had this dream to set up his own gym. Recently released a book actually called The Glorious, but I'll get into that a little bit later. But anyway, so I learned a lot with him, and luckily we kind of started to share a sort of bit of a vision together. And I saw how passionate he was about his work, and he was particularly interested in sort of giving inner city children around Manchester a chance to sort of get off the streets and get into sports and better themselves. So I actually applied for a series of different grants, and we got some projects together. We actually got a mobile unit and go into inner city schools. And over 6 months, it was a great success. We got funding for more. We did some other projects like creating a sort of sports power development coaching course, which he actually taught at universities. So during the course of that, I ended up extending it another 6 months just to carry on the project and work with the gym. So we actually got a good friendship together during that process. And then I moved on, went to Hong Kong and started working in other places. And occasionally I come back to visit him. And in the interim, he'd actually been asked by the Manchester United Football Club to come in and talk with them, because his 2 sons who played for them, one for the first team, one for the reserve team, they weren't actually that amazing at their football skills, but their physical prowess was way superior to all the other players. So they actually got Mick in to quiz and say, what are you doing here? How have you done this? And after he told them, they gave him a job on the spot. And this is at a time, I'm not sure of the date now, maybe around 2003, 2004. This is when the sort of physical fitness training didn't really exist other than some running in English soccer. And he was actually the first, technically strength and conditioning, but he was more focused on what he called power development. So the first coach to actually work with players in this capacity in the UK. Other countries were ahead of the curve. And he had a lot of difficulty actually, because at that time, people believed that if you just lifted a few weights, it would make you stiff and it would ruin your skills, and that was the thinking. So he had a lot to actually break through. But he was also a very interesting sort of psychologist. So he got into the mindsets, he found the leaders of the players, allied with them. And then very quickly, he just ended up getting most of the players in the club to come in day out, work with him at the gym as a standard routine. And it was all voluntary basis. So that in itself was a significant achievement. But anyway, the overlap with me is sometimes I go back and he'd ask me to go down. I'll do a bit of consultancy work from a sports science perspective, because I have a sports science background. So I'd interview the players like David Beckham and find out how they're finding this new form of training they'd never done. I help him design pre-season training strategies. So just little bits here and there. And then one day I was working in Malaysia, and he just called me up out of the blue, and he'd had this epiphany, because getting to know the players as studying in such an in-depth fashion, he clicked that the one thing that made like the Ruud van Nistelrooys and the Ronaldos just a world class apart, like truly world class players, is what he called rapid cognition. So, for example, and I'll come back to his book now, because he worked with the club for 11 years, worked with lots of the best players in the world. But one of the stories he tells in the book is Ruud van Nistelrooy, who was the most prolific goal scorer ever for Manchester United. He actually told me, like personally, that all he sort of focused on doing was to get into the penalty box area in a match. And then when he did, the next thing, the ball was in the back of the net and he had no idea what happened, no memory whatsoever. So he went into this, what Mick sometimes terms as sort of quantum consciousness, but it's really like automaticity. So the brain had actually dropped its consciousness and gone fully automatic because it's operating on timescales and reaction speed that just cannot be processed consciously anyway. Like in tennis, like a tennis serve, you cannot respond to that consciously, you have to do it automatically. So he discovered this thing, what really made him special was rapid cognition, but he had this problem, like he had no method to train it or how to harness it. So he rang me up and literally gave me the task to say, go out and find a method to actually train rapid cognition. So I did quite a bit of research. I even actually looked into computer gaming because there is actually, and it's still developing now, some significant research to show it can improve certain types of cognitive functions, but generally requires a lot of training with minimal benefit. And some other famous neuroscientists I reached out to had discussions, but then I came across Jocelyn Faubert's research with NeuroTracker, which then was known as 3D multiple object tracking, or 3D MOT. So Professor Faubert actually technically a psychophysicist, which means he's an expert at studying how the brain receives sensory inputs and interprets that to effectively simulate a reality that it can operate in, which is about the internal model, the sort of loop feedback and recognizing patterns, making predictions, testing them, and then modeling behavior around it. So he'd actually developed this 3D multiple object tracking technique as a way to investigate that. One, to see, can you assess these brain functions? And two, to see are they actually significantly trainable? Can they be enhanced in any significant ways? So I actually managed to have a call with Professor Aubert, and because of his time scale, he's very busy. I think we started the call about midnight his time, and we spoke non-stop till 2 in the morning. It was just a fascinating conversation. So with that, I actually got back to Mick at Manchester United and said, I think this is it. I think we found something really significant. And he'd been doing some research in aging, but coincidentally, he'd actually invited a few Canadian Olympic athletes into the lab to try it out, just purely experimental, exploratory. And he found they had really fast learning rates. So technically, there was some press releases showing that Olympic athletes improved their processing speed by 53%. So I had that to show him. I said, this looks very interesting. So Mick then got permission from Manchester United to be funded to do a trip to the lab, which is not common, completely, especially bringing in neuroscience at a time when, just physical fitness, strength and conditioning only just been sort of becoming accepted. And he was blown away. And the lab itself, especially at that time, it's a bit of a dream world because there's all these psychophysics experiments, but he also had this, what was called a cave, which is an immersive 3D environment. So today we have the Quest and things like that, the VR headsets, but then the only way to achieve it, so practically, was to have a 3D projector on a huge projection screen, and then to do that on the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. So wherever you look, you get a 3D projector. You have to have a stack of high-powered computers, each independently running each projector, and then they all synchronized to do with motion tracking to glasses which had sensors. So wherever you moved, wherever you looked, all the different projection screens will simultaneously update to reflect your new perspective. And that was the first real form of truly immersive virtual reality. Very powerful experience, actually. I mean, today's HMD VRs are very good, but that experience is something another level above. But it's expensive, multi-million-dollar something. So anyway, Mick checked all that out, got to experience that, NeuroTracker and all the other stuff. That's exciting. So he actually went back to the club, said, this is something I'd really like, to introduce you. So he got permission from the club to invite Professor Faubert over. And because I've worked with them, I actually put together a proposal of about 8 different applications of how sports science could make use of this sort of applied immersive virtual reality. NeuroTracker was one of them, which is already established, but some other theoretical ones. So they actually asked me to also co-present some of these other ideas. So I actually presented with Professor Faubert, and just at that time, the tech transfer company NeuroTracker founded, which basically a tech transfer company is a public commercial company that works with the university, licenses its technologies and gets them out into the real world and developed in ways that need to be done. That all went well. So we presented to Alex Ferguson, the director, sports science staff, all the staff actually turned up for presentations. We demoed to the players and they were really excited about it. So literally, I ended up signing up as a job for the company, moved back to Manchester and spent, I think, 3 months full time just working as one of the staff at Manchester United, and trained every player in the club with sports science teams, had lots of meetings with doctors and coaches and stuff like that. And the company began. So at the time, it was just a really rudimentary lab-based software, which had lots of failings. And we actually built our own version of the cave, but with only 3 projector screens, which was a project in itself, but we did get set up. We started to get people through it. We had some really interesting findings, and the data we collected was immediately of interest. And then from that point, I kind of, from working day in, day out and seeing what was needed, I sort of tried to map out and envision what the software needed to be to fit in this commercial context. So it's taking the lab sort of findings and what was developed in the software and thinking, okay, here's where it fits, here's where it doesn't, this is what we need to do. So then I moved to Montreal, moved into the CEO's house for a few weeks, and we had a team of us, and just literally in a few, well, probably about a month, actually completely built a brand new software from scratch. Not very well designed, and that bit is in the ass later on, because when we tried to build on it, we ended up with loads of bugs and stuff. But we got it fully functional, and we took it back to the club, and they just couldn't believe we produced a software from scratch out of nowhere. And that's kind of how the company started. From there, we sort of moved into lots of other world-class teams, actually, initially. So we focused on sports. Yeah, I sense you have a question.
Fascinating. It's fascinating. I'm going to set my question up with my own experience. So 2 years ago, I lost hearing in my right ear, and I have an acoustic neuroma that's attached to my vestibular nerve.
Right.
I have balance issues. And last week I went to a audiologist at the hospital not far from here, and they did they put these goggles on me, and they did an eye test to determine how my brain was managing this loss of balance. And so there was a screen, and I had these goggles on, and there was the room was dark, the screen was dark, except for a white square, and it was moving around, and I'm keep my head still, and I'm supposed to be moving my eyes, and I realized that I could tell where the diminishment of my balance capacity was, because what I was seeing was my right eye was slower than my left eye, and I was able to see how that, and I could tell how, I mean, and what that led to. So that led to the next session. The next person I went to see was a physical therapist, and she taught me some skills for developing that my vision, and which is really developing my mind to be able to compensate for this loss of balance that's in my. And so when I'm moving, I'm able to have better balance than I would if I did nothing. And so that's a little taste. I've had this little taste of what you're describing, and I can see how that kind of training can really have an effect upon an athlete, particularly an athlete on the field, like playing football, where they're constantly moving, they're constantly shifting, and they're constantly turning around, and they're never going. They're not just running one direction, they're running a half a dozen different directions all at the same time. I can see how this would be really, really significant. So my question is, how do you measure the increased capacity for these athletes? What does that look like? How do they know that this has had a positive effect upon their performance?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things there. But first of all, that's a fantastic example of the nature, one, of multi-sensory integration, the fact that the senses are independent, because the brain's taking all those different, tensional streams and fusing them and using bounce off each other. And also the second point is even very simple things to manipulate those processes can have quite significant impact, such as, you think just watching a little square, suddenly you got better balance, and it's like, wow. So yes, they can be transformative. So yeah, for NeuroTracker specifically, so I should probably just highlight first that the task is a little, it's again, like what you give an example, it's actually a very simple task, it takes 60 seconds to understand. And it's a little bit like if you see the people shuffling cards and you got to follow the card or under the cups, you know, you've got distractions, you just need to remember the one. In this case, typically it's 8 spheres in a virtual cube. We use 3D perception, and there's 4 of them that are highlighted, and then they all turn to the same 8 color balls. You have to remember the 4 that was highlighted for you, and then they all start to move and bounce around. So you think it would be a sort of an eye tracking task, but it's not. You don't actually move your eyes in this task, or maybe they only drift a little bit, because it's impossible to foldily track multiple targets simultaneously. So you actually have to not use your eyes as much and use the vision centers of your brain to spread your attention. Yeah.
So what you're correct me if I'm wrong. So what you're looking at your peripheral vision as more dominant than your focused vision in that regard.
Yeah, so there's probably 5 characteristics of this task. Like I say, it's like shuffling cups. It seems super simple, but actually it's quite demanding. So the first one is the fact that you're having to distribute your attention to 4 separate targets independently. And actually that's 4 different attentional streams. So different parts of the neocortex and the visual cortex are actually having to assign neurons to do each of those tasks separately. So this is a capacity we have. We don't test it very much. The probably closest real world example is driving a car. You're having to pay attention to what's going ahead. Somebody's pulling out here, a kid's just about across the road or something. You can't be looking around for those moments. You have to make sure you actually use your attentional resources, separate, segment, and independently track and monitor. So that itself is a significant task. So there's lots of research before NeuroTracker, which was just multiple object tracking, showing that, you know, once you increase the number of targets, the difficulty increases exponentially. So that's the first component. The second component is, yes, you're actually able to use your peripheral vision. And when actually, you know, it's not a case of passively, okay, we're always getting peripheral visual information, but when you're actually actively paying attention to it, you recruit a larger number of neurons to actually do that processing load, so it increases demands in the brain. Then we have something called a visual pivot, which is to help you prevent you trying to look at the object, just a dot in the center of the screen. You keep your center around that. And then we have then we have the 3D. So I should probably explain the 3D a little bit. So if it's getting more neuroscientific, then you don't need sort of glasses for 3D, because perspective, even the knowledge of something is, you know, there's an elephant stood next to a car, it helps you know how big the elephant in the car is, because you have knowledge of that. There's tonal perspective, there's all sorts of factors your brain can use. But the most powerful one is binocular stereoscopy. And that's specifically the difference in angle between the 2 eyes. So each eye is controlled by the visual cortex on the opposite side of the brain. But because your eyes are very sensitive sort of biomachinery, if you like, it can actually be measured very accurately, the angle they're looking at. So when the angles are aligned to focus on a specific object, the brain can use literally like trigonometry to calculate the angles between differences in perspective between each eye, and then use that to actually accurately calculate depth. And this is the reason why pretty much everything, at least mammals in nature, has 2 eyes, because eyes are expensive biological machinery, and they're also extremely costly in the brain. So it comes at a great cost. So this type of binocular stereoscopy processing is actually sort of the heavy lifting of the visual centers of the brain. It's the last thing to be processed. In terms of when we talk about psychophysics, it's this stream of information. There's a huge amount of visual information that flows in through the eyes. Once it comes in, even at the level of the retina, there's some neurons that do some initial computation, start filtering. It's segmented, so things like colors, luminance, movement, different attributes are segmented and sent to different regions of the visual cortex for independent processing, and then it's all built back together. And the more complex it is, the later it comes in to building back together. So stereoscopy is a really big factor, and that's one of the components. And interestingly, in the digital age, we don't stimulate our stereoscopic systems enough, and we possibly at risk of losing some of those capacities, which is some of the research I can get into. The last thing is speed thresholds, so I can explain that a little bit.
Yeah.
I sent another question there.
Well, I want to hear the speed thresholds, and then I'll ask my question.
Yeah, so the speed threshold. So one thing Professor built there and then it was one bringing in the 3D component, which turned out to be extremely important. That didn't exist in multiple object tracking research before. The other factor is instead of having an approach like varying the number of targets, he realized actually the speed or the velocity of the targets is more significant. And this actually interplays with having the stereoscopy, because with the stereoscopy, you're not looking at spheres moving or circles moving around on a flat plane. You've actually got depth, and judging the velocity of a moving object depends on, okay, how big is it, where is it in space, then you can sort of interpret its speed. So what he found was actually adjusting how fast the targets move way to adjust the difficulty of the task. And concurrently, it also then became a far more sensitive measure. So for example, you might have, can you track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 targets? That's quite crude. But with speed, we can measure that quite accurately. So then it becomes a case of having a result that could be 1.07 or 1.11, or but ranging from 0.2 all the way up into the 4s and 5 speeds. So the actual speed itself is actually it's because it's a virtual environment, even though it's just wearing 3D glasses, it's actually a representation of what an object would be moving in the real world. So as long as you sit the correct distance away from the screen, it's actually a simulation of what these balls were moving. So we can measure what those balls were moving if they were real balls, like tennis balls bouncing around. So with that, we get a way to very accurately adjust the difficulty and very accurately get a very precise measure of someone's performance capacity. We still vary the number of targets and the amount of tracking time, and we have other variables, but the principal one is a speed threshold. And related to this is the methodology of the actual NeuroTracker task itself, which takes about 6 minutes to do a session. And each session is composed of like 20 mini tests. We call them trials. So you'll be presented with the targets. You have to track them when they all mix up for 8 seconds. You identify them. If you get all your targets correct, then it speeds up on the next try. Get them correct again, it speeds up by a lot more. It just logarithmically. If you fail, if you miss one of them or more, it will start to reduce the speed. So actually, during a 6-minute session, we have these 20 mini tests. What you'll see is people start to sort of go up and down. And then what we do is we narrow in because we start to find their breaking point. And it's the breaking point that gives us our measure. So when somebody is failing at the task and succeeding at the task 50% of the time, that's the speed threshold zone, which is one, the most optimal way to get the best training response. And 2, it's our measure of where you're at. So a speed threshold result is a measure of where's your upper limit for tracking speed for this particular task.
I see all kinds of application for this. I see it in say Formula One racers, right? That they're going 190 miles an hour, and they're coming up to a turn where they're going to have to go from 190 miles an hour down to 30, in a very short period of time. And all this visual data is coming into them, and they really can't look at anything in particular. It's almost like I'm a Formula One fan. Yeah. It's almost like there's an embodied response that is non-conscious, I guess is the way to say it. Okay, so there's that. I see it in terms of people who play golf, people who play American baseball. As a kid, I loved playing baseball, but I was not very good at it because I didn't have the very good hand-eye coordination. And I've had bad eyes since I was in 5th grade. And so, and I know that my hand-eye coordination also contributed just to poor coordination with hands, because I never was in a position where I had enough capacity to do things where I could gain that facility, that capacity. So is there, and let me, one more, I see it also in terms of people who are use machinery, who are working where they're required to be manipulating large machines in a dangerous environment where their manipulation of wheels and paddles and things like that require them to be very consciously aware of what's going on in the setting where they're doing their work. I see all these things. So I guess the question is, can this be used to develop better hand-eye coordination, and can it be used to develop more better reflexes? Because I see those are two things that every athlete, but also every person, needs to have a high level of capacity for. Does this allow for a way of understanding the individual's hand-eye coordination and reaction time in such a way that then that can be addressed in some kind of developmental training process?
Yeah, fortunately, I have good answers to these types of questions. They're fascinating questions. And actually, that's quite insightful mentioning Formula One drivers. I can't name names because there's a number of drivers in F1 who use NeuroTracker. I can mention Romain Grosjean, who was a bit famous for crashing cars.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh,
One
yeah.
of our clients shared that
2
publicly.
years ago. Yeah. That was quite a wreck.
But yeah, so we kind of get into sort of different areas. One is like what you highlight in there is the sort of nature of the sort of demands of different domains of human performance, which is really significant, and that's big in itself. But what I can say is because we're born as a tech transfer company and we partner very closely with the lab, and Professor Gilbert is our chief science officer, then we've kind of had one commercial validation. We work with the US Air Force, NASA, military, esports, F1, and all sorts of really high-end human performance centers. So we've learned a lot through that. And two, the research itself, we're still a very science R&D based company, has kind of gone its own route independently. So there's now over 100, I'm at the moment trying to catalog them all, but there's over 100 published studies at least that have all been independently published, and nothing's been commercially funded. So it's pure organic neuroscience research. So it started off focusing sort of on aging and then sort of elite human performance, and it started off locally in sort of around Quebec, and it spread across Canada, US, and now it's kind of become global. And basically it's a path of each step of the research from the very beginning showed, okay, we've got some interesting findings here, and then other research comes and think, well, because it's an easy to use technology, how would it fit in this area? So during the course of that has been a really fascinating journey, a fascinating story. So maybe one of the biggest things which was found, and interestingly, this was completely incidental. So because we were working with like a number of the best sports teams around the world, who were sort of at the world class level, we actually had a lot of data, and we compared that data. One particular study that was done, which I was lucky enough to co-publish with Professor Gilbert, included analyzing the data of some of this early data from elite sports teams. I can't name the teams, but during the course of it, when the data was analyzed, we looked at, okay, where did they start out at? Is there a difference between NHL, the EPL, and these different sports? We have French rugby. And what is the learning curve trajectory? Because everybody improves at this task surprisingly fast. And of all those 100 studies, typically an intervention is around 3 hours of distributed training. It produces beautiful near transfer effects across high-level cognitive functions in the brain, and what you alluded to earlier, also far transfer effects to real-world performance, including motor skills and reaction times. But one hiccup occurred that one of these sports teams, their scores at the beginning were lower and their learning rate was much flatter. So it's something totally different, but it made no sense because they're still like the world's best athletes. It turned out that they did all their training standing up from the very beginning, whereas everybody else did it through instructive, which was sitting down and focused. And it turned out through later analysis that just the act of standing is like a different attentional demand. Just keeping balance, it's actually taxing the resources. So one, it reduced in lower sort of initial scores, and two, it hampered the learning because the brain wasn't getting fully engaged in the task itself. It was partially being distracted. So it was found that, actually isolating the training was the best way to get it to sort of progress and, get the most benefits. However, during the sort of like that 2-3 hours of early learning, there's a very steep learning phase, and then it starts to slow down. It keeps on going up over time, but it's a sort of law of diminishing returns. Now, interesting with the NeuroTracker training, one of the ways to sort of advance it to the next level is to do what we call dual tasks. So standing is probably the example of the simplest dual task you can do. So you go from sitting to standing, you'll see a drop in your scores. But what we've seen then, if you do some training, you'll quickly adapt to standing and you'll consolidate the dual task of standing. Then you can do standing on one foot, you can do more or you can do dual tasks. That could be mental arithmetic, language, perceptual, cognitive tests. There's all sorts of things that you can add in. And what's been found through research is that as long as you've got this initial learning curve consolidation, you prime the brain very quickly to be in a more ready state to learn and adapt to new demands, new tasks. And what we find is that you can start getting these tasks and make them more complicated over time, and you'll still match the level you could be at if you were just sitting down and being 100% focused. And incidentally, when it comes to sort of really complex dual tasks, and the most extreme is actually flying a jet plane and doing barrel rolls while doing NeuroTracker integrated into the dashboard, then if you consolidate and get to a very high level, you can actually achieve this ability to perform better at NeuroTracker doing something really complex at the same time than what you would do if you were just 100% focused sitting down on NeuroTracker. It actually gets the brain to stimulate, we call it facilitation effect.
That doesn't surprise
this whole
me at all.
new learning paradigm we discover about the brain, what's the most efficient path to learning, which is absolutely fascinating. Yeah,
that doesn't surprise me at all, because I know that when I need to concentrate, I put on some sound. It may be music, or it may be a quiet television show or something to distract a part of my brain, so I can actually focus on something that I'm working on. And I think that, I mean, that's a very simple and kind of very low grade version of doing a barrel roll and doing the NeuroTracker at the same time. And that doesn't surprise me at all. Oh, so here's the, have you know, there, I don't know if it's true around the world, but at least here in the States, there's a growing acceptance, let's say, of using psychedelic drugs to advance cognitive function. I'm putting it that way. Whether that's a precise enough way of describing it, I don't know. I'm not really clear. I don't have any interest in doing that kind of stuff, but there are a lot of people out there who do, and they say that their cognitive ability grows because of this. Have you all done any research where you're giving, you know, they're on a psycho?
We're very interested in it. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not so familiar with the research showing increases in cognitive functions, but I know from some of the latest research that it changes the sort of way the brain. So you think of the brain as you have the neocortex, which is a sort of 150,000 sort of neocortical columns about the size of a grain of rice. We're all packed in, and they sit over the top of the sort of older or more primitive part of the brain, which manages everything physiological, essentially, and more primal stuff like to do with fears, anxiety, and things like that. But you have this huge stack, and those different regions are all sort of sub-regions. They all talk to each other, and they all sort of, well, the thousand brain theory that's emerging at the moment suggests that they actually vote on the nature of reality and conclusions and behaviors and stuff like that. So when it comes to psychedelics, one of the principal effects is that generally in sort of normal day, the brain regions talk to each other a lot very locally. But when you take psychedelics, you get this long range networking. So areas of the brain that don't normally communicate or collaborate are suddenly merging. So this creates a new sort of perspective of reality. It's kind of coming at things from a new angle. It's getting the brain to exercise itself in ways it's not been used to exercising. And from that, it seems like, I mean, it's debatable, but I think the evidence is very strong generally from research initially from decades ago, before it got banned, to the modern findings, suggests that it can have dramatic psychological benefits. So the sense of seeing reality, seeing your own life, interpreting your place in life and those around you from a completely different perspective, but one that's more integrated. So the typical experience is to have a sort of dissolution of self, and to, you know, I've not been through it, I've never tried anything, I've always been interested in sort of therapeutic effects, but that seems to be the principal effect. But with that stimulation, there could be increased in neuroplasticity, could be benefits, but I'm not sure how well the research progressed. But we are very interested in combining psychedelic therapy with NeuroTracker for a lot of reasons, which is probably a can of worms. But one of them would be able to have more attentional control over the experience. So attentional control, when you think of, say, meditation or yoga or mindfulness practices, it's all about how, you know, so, you know, really experienced monks can harness their attention, even to take control of the older parts of the brain. You know, they can spontaneously control their own skin temperature, vary it by 5 degrees. And there's quite a bit of neuroscience research in this. So if you could actually improve that sort of attentional control during the experience, one, might amplify and get more benefits from it. And two, it might help to, because with these experiences, typically if there's trauma, that tends to get relived. And, anxiety can have a sort of running away effect. So it may be a way to be able to focus and say, I need to focus on this and not run away. I have a fear that's running away. So there's lots of interesting applications. But yeah, that is something of interest, combining that research approach.
So where does this where does NeuroTracker enter into this discussion about the asymmetrical nature of the two hemispheres of the brain? Where does that fit into this, what you all are studying?
So not so much, actually. There are sort of, hemisphere biases in visual processing, which is interesting in visual fields if something's more towards one side. So it can be used as a tool like that. But the thing that makes NeuroTracker quite different from any other cognitive assessment or cognitive or brain training application is, pretty much as far as I know, pretty much most things on the market or most assessment tools, what they do, because they want objective measurements, is they isolate very specific functions in the brain and try to just measure those, and then you get an objective, reliable measurement. And they'll do that for all these different systems. And then, the brain trainers will take those tests and turn them into fun games, but essentially they're doing the equivalent of assessment of very specific cognitive functions. That's great and especially useful if there's cognitive impairments or things going wrong, because you can detect this, there's this problem in this region of the brain, it's probably going to be impacting this. However, when it comes to looking at, okay, what does this tell us about real world performance? Does it really predict how well a soccer player? Well, there's some correlations, but they're not very strong, because you could think about it as an analogy. You could study and test every single muscle in the body and know them precisely, but it wouldn't really give you much predictability if you went and did cross-country skiing, because all those systems are going to have to work together in different ways, and you've got the cardiovascular system needs to support it. And you can think about the brain like that as well. There's only a certain amount of utility to isolating and measuring all these functions independently. You really need to know at the end of the day, how do they work together at the same time? What systems are being taxed when lots of these systems work together? And that's where NeuroTracker is really different. And I think there should be more tools like this. I think NeuroTracker is just the beginning, but tools that can give an accurate objective measurement, but at the same time, get the brain to integrate a lot of resources. And this was something found in the sort of early QEEG research, which was kind of quite surprising, because the task is purely visual. You're tracking targets, moving around. But because you're splitting the attention, and attention is multisensory, even internal thought processes drawing your attentional resources, there's a limited pool of attention. So, and probably combined with 3D stereoscopy, then what we see is not just activation in the visual cortex of these specific skills involved in the task, but we see lots of areas of the brain light up. Not only do they light up, then we see changes in brainwave frequencies that are sustained from the effects of training, even short training interventions. So we'll see things like auditory processing improvement, and those are sustainable changes. But particularly in the frontal lobe, we see a lot more activity that involved in more complex, higher order cognitive functions like decision making. And to back up that, what we've seen is so in brain training and cognition research generally, there's hardly ever any sort of research that looks at far or long range transfer. And with NeuroTracker, we see these QEEG assessments showing, this heightened activity in the frontal lobes, areas to do decision making. And then there was, for example, a soccer study published showed that 3 hours of training reduced sort of passing decision making errors by about a whopping 40%, just from 3 hours of distributed training. And that was, it was a double-blind assessment that was done by objective video analysis, and there was a placebo group as well as a passive group. So, and there's other research showing this sort of long-range transfer. And that's where it gets interesting, because if there are more, technologies that can take this approach of integrating brain functions, then there's likely to be a lot more understanding that comes in terms of how the brain actually works. So just with NeuroTracker, watching these balls bouncing around the screen, we've learned a lot, actually. So, for example, there was one sort of famous study that was published on the homepage of nature.com, and actually looked at these learning curves and actually compared like world-class athletes with elite amateurs who are in the NCAA and university students who did no sports whatsoever. And, it was debatable. A lot of people used to think as sports stars as dumb jocks, that this is an abstract intelligence test, if you like, and that they would fare poorly at it. We expected they would start off probably with higher scores, which they did. So they were higher than the amateur elite athletes, and amateur elite athletes were very similar to the university students who did non-sports. However, the fascinating bit was in the learning curve trajectory. You'd think these elite, these world-class athletes, because they started off at a much higher level, you think the other guys would catch up, they're intelligent, stuff like that. But actually, they skyrocketed in their learning curves. They were way superior. And the elite amateur athletes, they also accelerated away from the university students did non-sports. So for the first time, I believe, this actually gives us a window into the brain to say that actually what makes a sports star really special. It's not their physical prowess, their skills. You could take a million other, measurements or predictors, whatever you could think of, and almost none of them probably would be anywhere near the sort of correlational power of this learning curve. The takeaway is that, sports superstars have extremely plastic brains that are just built and wired to be highly adaptive, and probably highly adaptive outside their chosen field of expertise. There may be physiological limitations in terms of what else they could do, but they would probably, excel in other different domains as well. And that, to me, is absolutely fascinating, that you don't think of people having different brains in terms of the rate at which they learn. You just tend to think people have different levels of intelligence. So for the first time, you got this functional measure of this plasticity of the brain, which seems to predict who are the world's best athletes.
So the question is, I have two questions. First question is the performance of these elite athletes, is that nature or nurture?
So that was one of the questions that came up in that paper, and the complete answer, further research is no. But I actually think it's probably in between. It's probably epigenetics, and the fact that they're getting exposed at a young age. They probably didn't have any special genes in terms of brain function, maybe physiologically, or maybe they did. But I wouldn't be surprised at the pressures that you're put under as an elite athlete. Because I ran for Great Britain when I was a teenager. By the age of 16, I trained 3 times a day. It's a completely different lifestyle to an ordinary, non-sports lifestyle. Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are epigenetic influences that actually change it. And those get passed on 2 generations. So it could be that, if your father or grandfather was a sports star, then he may pass on those effects.
So the second question is does this affect changes in a person's DNA?
Well, that is epigenetics, is it actually? So in terms of DNA, it's structured in a certain way, but there's all these flexible switches that can be altered depending on environmental pressures, both negative and positive. So you can have
generations of going forward will be more adept at playing soccer.
Yeah, to give an example, it's a little scary, but there's some research I covered not so long ago on the effects of aspartame or aspartame. That artificial sweetener seems to trigger genetic changes in the brain, switch these genes to a way that actually induces anxiety, and those anxiety-induced brain structural changes from the genetic switches are passed down 2 generations, which to me is frightening, the idea that you could be in your own diet affecting the quality of life of your offspring.
20 years ago, I stopped drinking diet drinks because aspartame was giving me pain in my hands. There's like arthritic pain. And within a month of stopping drinking that, the pain went away. So I see a lot of these chemicals is very detrimental. Okay, third question.
Go for it.
Does this require, since this is an application with elite athletes, does this require that their coaches also go through something similar so that they can understand and adapt to the performance level of their teams?
So actually, we started off in elite sports, but commercially, they're not the easiest market to work with. There's lots of hoops to jump through and bureaucracy, and they're shareholder driven.
Okay.
Politics. So we still got a strong presence across a broad range of sports at the highest levels and through to lower levels. But actually, it's probably used more widely in sort of a combination of human performance and rehab. So a lot of our clients, probably about 1,000 centers that are clinics that are sort of either in the sports vision, neurovision, sort of straddling performance and rehab. That's where it's used very widely. So I can't talk about it in details, but we have a lot of clients who work in concussion because we're going through FDA process. But that's an example. So there may be an athlete or somebody who just wants to get back to their normal career, had a concussion, needs to rehabilitate their brain, which can be a very, very difficult process. So they actually, span the sort of point of injury to the recovery and then back to peak performance, and also hopefully then accelerate performance. So it's actually used quite widely. So the research itself has gone off in all these different paths. So we expected it to be high human performance, but actually quite quickly and fairly on it sort of branched into one area is concussions, another area was neurodegenerative diseases in aging, another area is neurodevelopmental issues in young children, and there's lots of other areas as well. But it's kind of grown like that, and really the message from those 1 in 3 plus studies is it seems to have a very, very wide application. And personally, from my perspective, okay, it's interesting, exciting, and you can take somebody who's like world-class performance and step them up to another level. But it's not as interesting as, can you get a kid with intellectual deficit or ADHD, at 6, 7 years old, giving them, 6 minutes training a day, and completely change their brain development trajectory, and then also their life trajectory if they actually get to, perform better in education, get better opportunities. That to me is like, phenomenal, potentially phenomenal benefits with a minimal amount of intervention with maximal benefits. Similar to the other end of the spectrum in aging, so there's one study done in Japan showing that 3 hours of NeuroTracker training can significantly reduce fall risk. Well, fall risk is a major threat to quality of life in older age. It impacts everything. Once somebody has a severe fall, the whole life. Also, they tend to become social isolated, stop driving, and that's what actually the opposite the brain needs to stay healthy into old age. It's getting a lack of stimulation. So it's actually sort of suffocating what the brain needs to get exposed to. So just, implementing it in sort of a healthy aging or in even, genetic conditions can dramatically, I think, improve quality of life. And we've seen some of that in the research. So those are examples where actually I think it's far more valuable than the sort of elite human performance applications.
It sounds like I need this because of my vertigo, which is persistent vertigo, and that would help me tremendously. So I'll have to look into this.
Well, one of the long-range transfer things is actually improvements in motor skills. There's a study published at Mexico General Hospital earlier this year that actually with dementia patients and mild cognitive impairment. And again, the standard 3-hour intervention, they ought to see if they could actually regain fine motor skill control. And in that, they did 3 batches of fine motor skill tests, and there was really significant improvements. That's literally just spreading out 3 hours of watching balls bounce around a screen, and suddenly you have new skills that you lost that you can recover for, and that's really important to quality of life, in all sorts of conditions. So yeah, it's certainly worth giving it a try.
Sounds like it. Well, this is really fascinating. How do people find out about this if they're interested? If they want to know more about NeuroTracker and maybe I don't know what the terminology is. How you all acquire the material? I don't even know what you're offering in the consumer space. What is it that you're selling to consumers? Let me put it that way.
Yeah, so strategically as a commercial company, we're not really at the consumer level. So we've been operating 13 years. We build up, a huge client base, which is us sell to businesses who then work with clients. They sell to their clients or work with clients. However, we do allow people to buy it independently as individual consumers. And it's literally a case of typing in NeuroTracker, go to the website. So it's NeuroTrackerX.com. And then you can just sign up. I think I'm not really in the sales side. I think it's typically around $30 a month. You just sign up and then you get a pair of glasses shipped to you. So what we do with these, it used to be very complicated to access the software. I'm not sure if the screen's interfering, but literally you put on these glasses over normal glasses and then we engineer the software. This is literally the old technology from the cinema days, but we've engineered these lenses to
3D 7,
be with our software, and we get a nice, clean, crisp stereo, which is functionally what we need. And the NeuroTracker environment itself is very simple because it's basically the color of the spheres and mostly a black background. So we actually get a pretty good, clinically, a pretty good sort of stimulation, if you like, of the 3D effects. So it makes a 2D screen into a 3D screen, whereas before we used to need to have 3D TVs or 3D projectors or dedicated rooms. So now it's very accessible. It's a case of, sign up, you download the software, it takes 2 minutes to install, and you can be doing a training session within like a minute or so. And there's literally there was this feasibility study done with kids with extremely low, like severe IQ problems, and they understood the task. They did it in the classroom, and we had 100% compliance, I think, from 40 students, all completed in 30 sessions independently. Yet they couldn't complete an actual neuropsych test because it was too complicated for them. But nobody, as far as I'm aware, had any issue being able to do the test sort of immediately. They can't get it within 60 seconds. So yeah, it's very simple to access and try. There's no real barriers to it. But we, as a company, we focus still sort of strategically on building up these sort of business operations, and then we're working at the large enterprise level as well.
Well, it would seem that people who deal with neuro issues, physicians, neurologists, not neurologists, but neurophysicists, people who address people's brain conditions. Sorry, I don't have the right.
But yes, I've talked to a lot of our sort of key clients, our key opinion leaders. We've worked with lots. So, like for example, there's a centre called Life Vision in the Netherlands, and they've worked with over 1,000 neurological conditions in the last year, and really successfully had really great treatment outcomes. So, actually, what I find is I learn a lot from the clients who practice, who have their own centres, but it always they rave on about how big the effects are and how large the benefits they found and how much of an impact it's had on their patients. And these are people who've been working with multiple neurotechnologies and techniques and interventions for many decades usually, and yet when they get into NeuroTracker and really understand it and apply it, it's the thing that brings everything together, as really sort of transformative outcomes. So it's always super nice to sort of hear those stories. Yeah.
Well, this is really great. I'm convinced I'll buy because I see it as going to be very helpful to me, not only in dealing with my balance issues, but also my cognitive issues as I get older. I just turned 70, and I plan to work until I'm 100. So at 100, I want to be cognitively alive and as sharp as I am right now. And I see this as one of those tools that can enable me to be there.
Yeah. So personally, this is anecdotal, but from all the people I've introduced it to directly, it's older populations that really see the benefits more clearly. I think because you actually experience a change in how you interact with the world. It's more noticeable. If you're somebody who's already up at a high level, okay, you might notice your ping pong gets a bit sharper or whatever, but it's much more obvious for people who actually, because they know where they've been at and where they're at now, and they can actually sense the shift. And like, for example, I know a guy who's in his 70s who has Alzheimer's quite seriously, and he religiously does 4 sessions per day, every day. He's in about 600 sessions now. That's mostly voluntary, so it's become his bread and butter. And you can't make people do something like that. It's just part of his daily life, because he actually sees and feels benefits of doing it.
Well, this is fantastically. I think this is a great innovation, and it's going to be helpful to a lot of people. And it's cool that it began with sports team.
Like I kind of hinted at, I hope it's a stepping stone to get into better technologies, further technologies. So like I say, it's quite a different direction than the neuroscience field, and especially the commercial domain. But from what the research shows and what the feedback we get and the industry partners we work with, this type of paradigm is probably going to be one that's going to progress the applications of neuroscience and neurotechnologies to a much higher level. And this is kind of still just the beginning. There's lots of more exciting things we do, like with, we use EEG feedback and all sorts of really cool, sophisticated stuff. But that's just with the core technique. But I think new methodologies that follow a similar approach to integrating brain functions in an objective, measurable way, I think that could really open things up. And it doesn't require new and sophisticated technologies. It's just about refining the scientific methodologies that drive those techniques. Yeah.
Very good.
It's accessible now if we, apply the research. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lee, for being with us, and thank you, everyone, for watching. I hope you learned something today. I know I did, and you will find the information about NeuroTracker and Lee's work in the show notes. And please subscribe and hit the like button and offer your thoughts and comments, and maybe you have a question that we can pass on to Lee, and maybe to help you discover something about your own brain functioning that maybe you can improve on, and which would be an ideal outcome of our conversation today. So thank you, Lee.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk NeuroTracker with anybody who's interested, or anything related in neuroscience field, neurotech. So, well,
we'll certainly connect you through the show notes so that other people can connect with you. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. It's been a blast. I very much enjoyed it. Yeah, it's some great questions.
It's been fun. And so we'll see you, everyone, next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye-bye.